guides were schoolboys from nearby Eton College who, on their own initiative, had sought and obtained permission to be there, and had formed an impromptu guard of honor along the tree-lined avenue that led to the main terminal. Others had climbed onto the roofs of the airport buildings, or had gathered behind the rope and timber barriers that marked out the landing enclosure. On the tarmac itself, an impressive array of VIPs had assembled, headed by the Lord Chamberlain, the Earl of Clarendon, who had been sent to represent the King and had arrived in good time. Alongside him was the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Harry Twyford, assorted cabinet members, the High Commissioners of all the Dominions, and the ambassadors of France and Italy, together with the German chargé d'affaires. Only the Foreign Secretary, the Earl of Halifax, had been less well organized. He and his wife had been collected from his home in Eaton Square by the permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, Sir Alexander Cadogan, and they made painfully slow progress through the heavy traffic. As they approached Heston, the sunshine gave way to a sudden heavy downpour of rain, and at one stage Cadogan was forced to drive his car down the wrong side of the road, almost unable to see through the windshield. A quarter of a mile from Heston, on hearing the distant sound of an aircraft, Cadogan accelerated and crashed his way through the crowds at the gates, the Foreign Secretary brandishing his police pass at the hapless constables on duty. At 5:38 p.m., the waiting crowds, by now drenched by the sudden cloudburst, also heard the roar of aircraft engines, and a few moments later the outline of the silver airplane could be made out against the thick, grey cloud. The aircraft in question was the very latest addition to the British Airways fleet, a Lockheed 14 Super Electra, call sign AFG-N, which had been delivered from the United States at the beginning of September. Just a fortnight earlier, it had set a new aviation distance record during its maiden flight, traveling non-stop to Stockholm and back in just over 10 hours. A few days previously, it had also carried Chamberlain on his second visit to Germany, indeed only the second time he had ever flown, to Bad Godesberg on the Rhine by way of Cologne. On that occasion, Chamberlain had later described his return to the cabinet. That morning he had flown up the river over London. He had imagined a German bomber flying the same course. He had asked himself what degree of protection we could afford to the thousands of homes which he had seen stretched out below him, and he had felt that we were in no position to justify waging a war today in order to prevent a war thereafter. Just as Cadogan pulled up alongside the other waiting cars on the tarmac, the Prime Minister's plane landed, followed by a second identical aircraft carrying his supporting officials. Both aircraft taxied toward the waiting crowd of dignitaries, press correspondents, and the general public. Possibly because of the heavy rain, the pilot appeared to overrun the main airport terminal, and he eventually came to a halt outside a nearby hangar, forcing the reception committee to half-walk, half-run to ensure that they kept up. As the doors swung open, the crowd surged forward as Chamberlain appeared. It had been a long and tiring journey, but he looked animated enough, and waved his hat at the assembled cheering throng. "I've got it!" he shouted at Halifax. "I've got it!" At the foot of the aircraft steps the Prime Minister was met first by Lord Clarendon, who handed him a letter. "From the King! From the King!" An excited murmur went round the crowd. Next to him was Lord Halifax, who doffed his bowler hat and shook hands with the Prime Minister. As the waiting journalists closed in around him, cameras and microphones were hastily erected to record his words. The BBC, their coverage anchored by the television reporter Richard Dimbleby, broke into their output to cover Chamberlain's speech live on the radio, while both television and newsreel cameras recorded the proceedings for broadcast that evening. Chamberlain paused for a moment before addressing the crowd. "There are only two things I want to say," he began. "First of all, I received an immense number of letters during all these anxious days, and so has my wife, letters of support and approval and gratitude, and I cannot tell you what an encouragement that has been to me. I want to thank the British people for what they have done. Next, I want to say that the settlement of the Czechoslovak problem, which has now been achieved, is in